because the meeting is. Did you go today? So the meeting is entitled "The Required Joint Action Between North American Central Banks." That's the subtitle of the final luncheon.
That was the subtitle of the final
luncheon, right?
But what did it mean?
So that's what we were asking. What is the required joint action?
They didn't even give any require. All they said was what we already know. We're in a crisis. There has to be greater public-private partnership, whatever.
It should be said, this is Ken from Montreal 9/11 Truth, and he was in the meeting.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. I was in a journalistic capacity attending the conference because I do write for Maghreb Observateur, and my editor wanted me to attend and cover it. So it is in that capacity I was there.
So what would you say about the meeting?
It's not really a meeting. There are a bunch of speeches and we take notes.
Right.
I think that...
like a lecture?
Yeah, it's more like a bunch of lectures.
Yeah.
The people who speak, or who actually spoke, first of all, it's not accurate to say that the Canadian banks were spared any hint of crisis. It's just not true. The Canadian taxpayer bailed out our banks to the tune of $75 billion. So in fact, the bank bailout in Canada on a per capita basis mirrors the one that took place in the States. They bailed out their banks to the tune of roughly $750 billion. It was done in exactly the same way in Canada, but 1/10 of that money. The only difference being that there was very little public awareness insofar as it was done by way of administrative order in council in some way. So it was not the subject of discussion in Parliament. And nevertheless, the speakers from other countries who spoke seemed not to be aware of that. The Governor of the Bank of Canada, I would be very hard pressed to think the Governor of the Bank of Canada was unaware of that. I find that impossible to understand. So when the Governor of the Bank of Canada says, we were spared and we didn't have to bail out our banks, he didn't actually say it. He said we were spared the ravages and Canadian banks are much more solid. On whose account are they solid? I would submit that if we bailed out the banks to the tune of $75 billion, then the solidity stems from the taxpayers' wallets. And certainly the harsh economic medicine that the bankers themselves were prescribing for welfare recipients and small business owners 10 and 15 years ago is now curiously being forgotten. They no longer talk about this because they know now that they've had to go to government for bailouts, given the fact that they engage in very faulty, shaky investments. And to give you an example, TD, which got stuck in Argentina. Well, who bailed out TD from Argentina?
I don't know.
They sustained very heavy losses when Argentina melted down. Who bailed them out? Joe taxpayer did. That's a fact.
It's true. You don't really hear much about. I find you don't hear much about Canada.
To the financial sector.
You never hear about Canada and all this stuff.
No.
You're always hearing about the U.S. and their bailouts.
Because at least it's public in the U.S. Whatever one may say about the American system, it's public. In Canada, things are done rather hush-hush. And we pretend that we're not bailing out, and we pretend that we're totally solvent and isolated from the whole thing, and it's just not even true. CBC Television News, I think it was Sunday Report, did a very detailed report on what can best be described as totally corrupt practices engaged in by Canadian banks, namely the trading in asset-backed commercial paper, and the assets that were supposedly backing this so-called commercial paper were none other than mortgaged homes. And banks in Canada were and still are very strenuously encouraging people, particularly retirees, to mortgage their homes. And they are thus trading in this commercial paper. It is something that verges on the criminal and should be deemed as such, legally. It was the subject of a very extensive CBC report that was broadcast more than once. So how we can say that our financial sector is much more regulated? It's nice mythology. One would like to believe that we live in a land with Mickey Mouse as prime minister, but the reality is something else. At least in the States, it got the time of day, and yes, people got burned and so on, but it became an issue of public discussion and debate. Here, there was no public discussion other than what the CBC put forward, and that was to its great credit. But there was absolutely no action taken on a legislative basis. No legislative action at all, no investigative action. Not one banker was taken to the cleaners, not one banker was made to appear before any parliamentary or other legislative body to account for this totally corrupt and shameful practice. And people are being taken to the cleaners with these loans and mortgages that are that are designed to fail. So I think it's really disgusting, and I think the fact that we've had no serious look at this, and the fact that we keep on glossing it over with this fine national mythology that somehow we're cut above the States and Western European countries, I think is very sad.